What if an entire city once existed in the middle of a desert and the earth tried to erase it? Not with fire, not with war, but with silence. One day, people trade and laugh under tall walls. The next, the dunes roll in like a slow ocean. And centuries later, all that's left is a name that sounds like a warning. Ubar, the Atlantis of the sands. Did it really exist? Or did you inherit a myth that grew bigger than any real city ever could? Start with something simple. The Arabian Peninsula has always had empty places. Not just empty of people, but empty of roads, empty of landmarks, empty of memory. The empty quarter, the Rub al-Khali, is one of the largest sand deserts on Earth. And deserts do something strange to history. They don't just bury objects. They bury stories. Trade routes shift. Wells dry up. And a few generations later, what used to be obvious becomes impossible to locate. Now add a second fact. For thousands of years, southern Arabia was famous for something you don't think about much today: frankincense and myrrh. Aromatic resins. They were luxury goods in the ancient world, used in temples, funerals, and medicine from Egypt to Rome to India. There were incense routes, long-distance caravan networks that moved these resins northward through harsh terrain. Those routes needed watering points. They needed stopping places. They needed forts, markets, storage, guards. Somewhere in that system, there would have been hubs. Then comes the name. Ancient writers mention an Arabia full of wealth and exotic goods, and Islamic tradition preserves stories about a people called Ad and a place called Iram, sometimes described as a city of lofty pillars, destroyed for arrogance. The Quran mentions Iram of the Pillars. Over time, Western explorers and writers began to attach these images to a single lost city, a glittering center of trade that vanished beneath sand, Ubar. And now you feel the pull, because the ingredients are real. A deadly desert, a valuable trade, oral traditions that remember a catastrophe. If you were building a mystery, this is exactly how you do it. The story sharpens when you look at how deserts can actually swallow places. Sand doesn't need to fall from the sky like a blanket. It moves sideways. Wind pushes grains over years, and dunes migrate like slow creatures. If a settlement loses its water source, people leave, roofs collapse, walls weaken, and sand starts to fill the cavities. A place can disappear without a single dramatic moment. And the empty quarter has another trick: sinkholes. Beneath parts of Oman and Yemen are limestone and ancient sediments that can dissolve and collapse. If a settlement relied on a well, a spring, or an underground water channel, the ground itself could fail. Imagine a fortified stop on a trade route built near a reliable water source. Then the water changes. The ground gives way. Even if it doesn't swallow the whole city at once, it could make the place unlivable. People would call it cursed. They detail the story until the details blurred into legend. The more you look, the more the coincidences stack up. There are historical references to prosperous regions in southern Arabia. There's real evidence of long-distance caravans. There are ruins of ancient settlements and forts scattered along the edges of the empty quarter. There are also accounts from modern times, Bedouin stories of buried structures, lost wells, strange stones under dunes. None of that proves Ubar, but it creates a feeling. Like you're looking at a map with one blank space labeled, in faint ink, "Here be something." Then, in the late 20th century, the mystery seems to crack open. In the early 1990s, researchers and filmmakers publicized a discovery in Oman, near a place called Shisr, at the edge of the empty quarter. What made it feel cinematic wasn't just the excavation. It was the method. Satellite imagery and remote sensing were used to spot faint lines in the desert, tracks that looked like ancient caravan routes converging on one point. When archaeologists dug there, they found the remains of a fortified structure and evidence of collapse. There was a central tower-like feature. There were walls, and beneath it, a sinkhole-like depression. The site became linked in headlines and documentaries to Ubar, the lost city. For a moment, it seems too perfect. Caravans converging like veins to a heart, a fort on the desert's edge, a catastrophic collapse, a name from legend waiting to be pinned to a real location. So you follow the implications. If this was Ubar, then the story changes from myth to history. It would mean oral tradition preserved a real memory of an actual place and an actual disaster. It would mean the incense trade wasn't just scattered stops, but a network with central nodes powerful enough to be remembered for millennia. It would also mean we could use modern technology to resurrect other impossible, lost cities by reading the desert like a hard drive that still holds faint data. And it gets stranger when you realize how many disciplines touch the question. Archaeology gives you stones and pottery. Geology gives you sinkholes and groundwater. Ancient history gives you trade records and Roman appetites. Religious studies gives you how stories transform under centuries of retelling. Even climatology matters because Arabia's climate has shifted over long time scales. There were periods when parts of Arabia were wetter, supporting more travel and settlement, and later became harsher. A hub that thrived in one climate could fail in another. At this point, it feels like you're not just hunting a city. You're hunting the boundary between memory and imagination. And real authorities have taken the question seriously, just not always in the way the legend wants. Archaeologists in Oman excavated Shisr. Researchers used satellite data to reconstruct possible ancient routes. Scholars of the incense trade have studied where frankincense was produced, how it moved, and why certain regions became wealthy. Historians have long debated what ancient texts actually describe when they talk about Arabia Felix, the fertile or fortunate Arabia. Even the term Ubar itself has been examined. Is it a city, a region, a tribe, or a misunderstanding that hardened into a proper noun? Then the narrative turns. Because around the time the headlines declared the Atlantis of the sands found, many archaeologists pushed back. Here's the twist. The dominant scientific view is that Shisr is real, but it's probably not what the legend promises. Most experts do not think a vast metropolis was swallowed whole by the dunes. The site at Shisr appears to be a fortified outpost or caravanserai, important, yes, but limited in size. The converging routes seen from satellites may include tracks from many different periods, not all leading to a single golden age. And the collapse could be structural failure over time, not a sudden divine punishment that erased a city overnight. Even the language matters. The phrase "lost city of Ubar" became popular partly through media storytelling. Archaeologists tend to be careful with that. A city suggests dense population, streets, layers of urban life. The evidence at Shisr doesn't automatically give you that. It gives you a strategic point, possibly a well station on the edge of a massive desert. And the legendary sources don't line up neatly. Iram, in Islamic tradition, may not refer to a specific archaeological site at all. It could be symbolic. It could refer to a people. It could refer to a region. Or it could be a story designed to teach, not to map. When later writers treated it like a treasure map, they may have turned metaphor into coordinates. So the same facts you used to build Ubar can be read another way. Ancient incense routes existed, but they may have been more flexible than a single highway. Forts existed, but forts don't equal a lost metropolis. Sinkholes happen, but sinkholes don't need a legendary city to be interesting. And oral traditions can preserve memories, but they also evolve, absorbing other stories, stretching a place into a symbol. But the mystery doesn't die, it just changes shape. Because the mainstream explanation has its own cracks. If Shisr was only an outpost, why did so many routes seem to converge there? Why do multiple traditions cluster around the idea of a destroyed, wealthy place in the sands? Why does the desert produce these persistent, phantom cities in human imagination, as if the landscape itself invites the idea that something is missing? And the archaeological record in a place like the empty quarter is brutally incomplete. Sand hides, but it also protects. Some sites are deeply buried and hard to detect. Political borders, logistics, and the sheer scale of the desert limit exploration. You could argue that declaring there was no city is also a kind of story, one that assumes absence of evidence is evidence of absence. In deserts, that's a dangerous assumption. There's also a subtler possibility. Maybe Ubar was never one place. Maybe it was a shifting label for a trade region, or a network of settlements, or a confederation that controlled wells and routes. In that case, searching for one dramatic set of ruins is like trying to find the internet by digging up a single server. The real thing would be distributed, powerful, but not centralized in a way that leaves a single monumental corpse. And then there's you, standing between two temptations. One is to want the myth to be literally true, a glittering city, a single night of destruction, sand pouring in like judgment. The other is to want the debunking to be total, just a fort, just a story, nothing to see. Reality is usually less satisfying and more interesting. Humans build meanings on top of places. A modest outpost can become, in memory, the gate to a kingdom. A slow economic decline can become, in legend, a sudden punishment. A collapsed well can become a swallowed city. Over centuries, the story doesn't just describe the ruins, it becomes part of the ruins. So did Ubar really exist? If by Ubar you mean a vast metropolis like a desert Rome, the evidence is thin. If you mean a real, strategically vital place tied to the incense trade, erased by time, abandonment, and geology, then the answer is much harder to dismiss. And if you mean the idea that the desert can delete a chapter of human history so completely that even its outline becomes controversial, then Ubar exists every time you look at an empty horizon and feel certain something used to be there. Maybe the deeper question is whether a city was swallowed by sand. Maybe it's why you want it to be. Because somewhere between satellite images and campfire stories, you realize that lost cities aren't only made of stone. They're made of longing, your desire to believe the world still has secrets big enough to survive you. And as the dunes keep moving, grain by grain, the desert doesn't just bury ruins. It edits the past until all that remains is a name, drifting in the wind, asking to be found.